Hi everyone, it's Scottican here again today, and I thought it would be fun to do a wee video on the Scots language. This week on the website I've had a lot of entries on Scots in general, so I thought today I might introduce you guys a little bit more to Scots as a language, things that I know and have learned about it. I am currently in the middle of taking a course with the Open University on the Scots language, and I will include a link to that down in the description because it really introduces you to the Scots language through use of history and culture and even things like food and entertainment and craft and politics. I didn't realize I would get such an in-depth history of Scotland through the course. You're learning Scots through the medium of learning more about Scotland, and it makes sense, but it's also really exciting and fascinating to do. So you will get to learn Scots words. You'll get to both hear how Scots is spoken and get an opportunity to record yourself speaking Scots, which is kind of fun, which, will then also totally help you do what I do, which is dip into a terrible Scottish accent, because Scots is one of those languages where having the accent does sort of help. And this video, I'm going to include some of the things that I've learned from there that I think are fascinating about the Scots language, as well as tips for how you can understand Scots a little bit more when you're in Scotland, and I might throw out a few different Scots words and phrases as I think about them. But let's start with Scots as a language as a whole first. A lot of people, even people in Scotland, wouldn't consider Scots to actually be a language, but it is one of the 3 national languages of Scotland, which also include English and Gaelic. So it is considered a language in and of itself, but a lot of people, even people in Scotland, would not consider it a language because what a lot of people consider it more to be is just a way of speaking, sort of like slang. So a lot of people have a hard time with the idea that Scots is actually a language. They think it's kind of just bad English, so to speak. But it is actually a language in and of itself, and it is considered a non-standard language, meaning that it does not have strict and hard rules for things like writing. And I think that could also be where people start to perceive that it's not really a language, because there are no hard and fast rules on how it is meant to be written and even how it's meant to be spoken, in a sense, because it's a living language. It's constantly evolving and growing through everyday usage. But you'll go onto places like Twitter. Scottish Twitter is it's an absolute joy to go to. I don't know if any of you have seen some of the handful of quality Scottish tweets out there, but they are awesome. And I think a lot of people find the humor in it because you can hear it in your head even when you're reading it. But to get back to the point of it being a non-standard language, you'll see that people will use Scots words, but they might spell it differently. For example, one word that I used in an entry earlier this week, ye. I would often spell that G-I-E, but there are others that might spell it just G-E-E. But that's why it's an interesting language in and of itself, because it really does also depend upon you not only understanding Scots as a language, but it also requires you to have sort of an understanding of the dialect and the Scottish accent. Because once you're able to include that in the Scots words, phrases that you're either trying to read or listen to, it really helps you understand it better. The other way it's considered a language is that when you are listening to Scots, or to a Scottish person speak Scots in their own dialect, in their own tongue, with their own accent, your brain does actually treat it like a language. So when you hear someone speaking Scots, your brain starts having to do that same translation. I have a friend who, he said something to me and I'll sit there like processing, and I'll finally just say, what? So he can repeat himself, but by the time I've said the word what, it finally clicks in my head what he's just said, and I can turn around and go, no, wait a minute, I figured it out, and here's my response. Because usually that's if you don't have a good response, that's always a good response to people, right? In times like that is how I can see that Scots can be a language, because my brain does have to do that translating back and like, okay, what am I hearing? What am I doing? What am I doing? So that's why it's important to get to know the accent, to get to know the dialect, to get to know the different ways of speaking, because Scots is it's fascinating, but there's a lot to it. Before I get into that more, let me talk a little bit again. Let me bring back that whole topic about it being bad English. So there are elements of English within it, but there's also elements of other languages in it, which you will get a lot more into if you do decide to take that Scots course through the Open University. There's Norse tied into there. There's some French connections. There's also some German connections to the language. There's a lot that Scots sort of pulls from, just the same way English pulls from a lot of different languages, because there's a whole history and methodology behind it, whether or not we realize it. It's the spoken language of people. There are whole words and whole phrases that do not match in English. So we can't just say that it's poorly spoken English or poorly written English, because it's not simply that. That whole idea, it's basically a way to kind of deride an entire culture, an entire heritage of ways of people speaking. It's very easy for those in power to simply write off what they deem to be inferior in an effort to try to shut it down. And it's the same sort of thing with Scots. Scots has a very rich heritage and culture. Think about the fact that the bard, Robert Burns, wrote exclusively in Scots, and he's celebrated to this day in Scotland and around the world. So to just try to close out Scots and write it off as just bad English as a way to get people to adhere to what we want to believe is better standards, I think it's just wrong. And this is something that actually took me some time to come around to, mainly because I was an English major in my undergraduate years. So I, in the past, have been someone that's like, well, it's really important that if you're writing something, you're writing a book, you're writing a story, you're writing anything, you're speaking in a certain way, that your reader and the person you're talking to understands what's being said. And there's been times where I've looked at Scots as a written language, again, a non-standard language that does not have hard and fast rules on how it needs to be written and spoken. So I've been the person that will look at something that's written to try to express a dialect or an accent, and I've seen that it's been spelled wrong and things like that. It's not proper English, and my English major brain starts going off like, no, this is wrong, this is wrong. I'm a writer myself. I think it's important to have things that are published in a good and coherent manner. I think it's really important to do things like editing and making sure everything is easily understood by the reader. So that's why it did take me a while to come around to the idea of Scots being a language, because the more I listened to it, the more I worked with it, the more I read with it, the more it made sense. And also just the plain and simple fact that when you try to shut down the ways people speak, you're closing doors and trying to enforce a lifestyle onto people, and I don't agree with that. Now, you will have people who will argue against that Scots isn't something that should be taught or spoken, and the English major in me does understand that mentality, but I do think it's really important that we keep culture and heritage, just the same way there are people who would argue that we don't need Gaelic in schools. I don't like the idea of seeing the Gaelic language die, because it's something that is so very much tied to Scotland and her culture and her personality, in a sense. I think it's important to keep things around, yes, for heritage, but also for helping us stay connected to our roots, and because language is just a beautiful thing. I like language. I love language. My study of English came because, yes, I love writing, but I liked learning the rules of language. I think languages are so important because they help us communicate in a variety of different ways. When you learn a language and you can understand how Spanish formulates words and sentences and phrases in one way, and how Gaelic can do it in another way, it opens your mind to the possibility of how we can continue creating in written form, and I don't like the idea of ever shutting out languages. And I'm the same way with Scots, because Scots is tied to maybe not what we would consider the ancient ancestral Scottish culture. In a way, it definitely was, because Scotland has always had its own language and way of communicating, just the same way that in America, the way we communicate in, say, the North is different than the way people communicate in the South. There's nothing good, bad, wrong, or otherwise about how we communicate, it's just different. And it's the same with Scotland. With Scots, I think of it as very much a modern language, because I hear still so many people communicating through the medium of Scots without even realizing it, just on the streets of Glasgow, Edinburgh, wherever you go, everywhere. And it's something that, like, you know, if you've been to Scotland for the first time, you're not going to understand it, because it literally is a whole different language that needs to be learned. But it's not just a singular language that is exclusive to all of Scotland. Scots can actually be broken down by different regions of Scotland, like Glaswegian, and how it can be a language in and of itself. And that's 100% true. I know that there have been plenty of times where I have struggled with my Glaswegian friends, especially if it's been a while since I've talked to them or seen them in person. And, you know, all of a sudden we're having a conversation, they start talking really fast, and I'm just like, whoa, 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 you gotta tone it down there, buddy. And again, like, Scots is exclusive to the region that you're speaking in. So Glaswegian Scots might have one way of speaking, might have different dialects, different phrasings, different ways of hearing things, and I totally hear that versus someone who was raised in, say, Edinburgh. So then you also have Doric, which is another variant of Scots. And if any of you are familiar with the Disney film Brave, one of the younger clansmen, young MacGuffin, anytime he speaks, no one can understand what he says. That's part of the joke. The joke there is that he's speaking Doric. So it's something that a lot of Scots got that maybe you didn't quite get when you watched the film. But the whole point of that was the fact that he's speaking another variant of Scots, one that can be quite challenging to understand, especially like that's like Scots 2.0. Because I've tried to listen to Doric. I was feeling like pretty confident in myself, because I'm familiar with the Scottish accent at this point. I'm familiar with communicating and listening and speaking to things in Scots now and then. I've written things in Scots. I'm not going to say that I'm a professional, because I obviously was not born and bred in Scotland. You can tell by my accent. You can tell by the terrible Scottish accent that I do that loses me friends every time I pull it out. But I thought, like, I was convinced. I was like, no, I'm going to understand Doric. As soon as I sat down to listen to it and it started getting more in depth and more into it and people were just speaking it more and more, I was like, what? My confidence just kind of went down. But again, a lot of it takes like listening to it and acclimatizing your brain to it. But that's part of the whole thing. It's also the way we encourage people to learn a language in general. What we encourage people to do, listen to it, hear it, familiarize your brain with it, acclimatize your way of thinking to it. It's one of the ways that you can improve your Gaelic as well, like listening to it, hearing it, because your brain needs to start processing it in a different way. So that's why I would encourage people, like, if you're interested in learning Scots, if you're wanting to learn to speak it, to understand it, to even write with it, start with the basics and just start by listening to Scottish people speak. Because I think the first thing you need to get used to is accents before you can start digging into dialects and languages. The accent is important because I know so many people who don't understand a Scottish accent. They'll watch the film Brave, and young MacGuffin isn't the only one that they don't understand. They can't understand anyone in the film. Or someone will watch an interview with Sam Hewing of Outlander, and while in Outlander he's putting on a much thicker accent because he's a Highlander, when you hear him do an interview, his Scottish accent isn't very strong. He's even said he thinks sounds slightly closer to an English accent because it's not a very thick, broad Scottish accent. And because of how thick and broad most Scottish accents can be, it's really important you get the ear for the accent first. And I think that's where I had a lot of benefits too. I would meet Scottish people in Scotland and get to just hear the accent more. And a lot of times my friends were very understanding about the fact that I'm trying to pick up the different ways that people are speaking, along with acclimatizing myself to an accent. This is why it's very lucky that we live in a digital age. You can go onto YouTube and listen to different Scottish YouTubers that are out there. You can go onto Netflix and watch shows like Still Game or Rabsy Nesbitt or Chewin' the Fat and things like that. They've got shows out there where you can get sort of an idea for the accent. It's a good way to just start to get used to things. Once you feel more confident with understanding English through the means of a Scottish accent, then you should be able to find different like television shows or YouTube videos or even podcasts where people do speak in Scots. So start off with the accents and then move on to Scots. And then I guess the other thing I want to talk about a little bit more was just some different other words that you might see in Scots. And I know there's a few that I wanted to include here. So one word I have is peace. Peace means sandwich. When I go to Scotland, I'm very much, it sounds so silly, I'm very much in love with Lurpak butter. I can't even give Scotland credit for Lurpak, but it's only when I'm in Scotland that I can get Lurpak butter. So I just kept having buttered rolls. I was getting like these Scottish morning rolls, and I was just buttering them up and just having them so much because they were just so good, you guys. I can't. I miss them so much. I'm basically just hungry right now. And one of my friends came into the kitchen and I was telling him about my struggles. I'm like, I'm just sitting here eating buttered rolls. This isn't healthy. I need to eat something substantial. And he's just like, well, if you want to make yourself feel better, just say you're having a piece in butter, because then it sounds like you're having something more than just a buttered roll. And I was like, you know what? That actually works. So a piece and something. Piece and jam would be like a jam sandwich. Then there are other things, you know, again, this is stuff that I notice when I'm watching things like Still Game, where you hear someone say deed instead of dead. You know, things like that. So there's definitely subtleties, intricacies, and lots of different ways that people use, speak, work with Scots, both through the medium of television, TV shows, films, but also in writing and online. It's really wonderful and it's really fascinating, and I just wanted to give people a bit of a taste, a bit of an understanding about Scots and what it is. I had primarily thought that it was just a dialect, and the more I learned from this course, the more I delved into it, the more I realized it's both. It's a language and a dialect on its own, and the course actually openly says that. So I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope it encourages you, if you have the interest, to maybe sign up for the online course, learn a bit more about Scotland, the culture and the heritage, while also learning about the Scots language. Or enjoy some Scottish programming where you can actually hear Scots being used and worked with. Whatever you decide to do, I hope that, I don't know, I hope a lot of things actually. But most importantly, I hope you have a good day, I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you all are staying safe, happy, and healthy out there in the world right now. Thanks everyone. Bye!